Good morning. Welcome to the Deep 404. I'm going to cover off a couple of things today. Joseph Borrell of the EU has called out Benjamin Netanyahu for allowing the financing of Hamas. Israel have threatened Hezbollah with an expanded offensive on the border with Lebanon. Benjamin Netanyahu has stated that Israel will have control over the area from the river to the sea, excluding a two-piece plan, it seems. Lloyd Austin allegedly speaks with Swedish Minister of Defence, Jonson, but still we get no photos or video evidence of Lloyd Austin. Russia is making gains against Ukraine in Donetsk and Zaporozhia regions. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, is Sweden next on the US's proxy menu in Europe? So that's where I'd like to start things. There's starting to be some parallels being drawn between Sweden and Ukraine. Ukraine, as many people are aware, has become a proxy tool for the United States to war against Russia. There have been comments from Kuleba, the Ukrainian minister, that Ukraine has provided an amazing service to the United States. No Americans have been killed in this conflict. David Cameron, or Lord David Cameron now, ex-British Prime Minister, now the Foreign Secretary in Britain, has stated at a meeting in Davos that basically he's said to his American colleagues, what a wonderful deal we've done. You guys have spent 10% of your defence budget and we have destroyed 50% of the Russian weapons, and all for without the loss of a single American life. Clearly not particularly concerned with the 500,000 or so Ukrainians who have been killed and wounded, as this has been claimed by Ukrainian Interior Minister this week. So this isn't the Russian claim of this number of numbers. This is coming from a Ukrainian Interior Minister from the Verkhovna Rada, the parliament in Ukraine, where he has said, look, let's tell the truth. We're losing 30,000 men killed and wounded a day. So Ukraine, as John Mearsheimer warned us about years ago, is being wrecked in this conflict with Russia. The US has led Ukraine up the Primrose Path, and it is now being destroyed and has been acting as a proxy for the United States. The United States can feed weapons and aid, and the Ukrainian men and women can fight and die on the front lines for the United States. Now, why am I talking about Sweden in this context? Well, Ukraine isn't in NATO. Now, the push to get Ukraine into NATO is part of what has led to this conflict, in a large part. Russia has responded to that. That was a red line stated a long time ago by President Putin. The Minsk agreements were put in place, but not honoured by the West, not honoured by the Germans, the US, the French, and all that sort of thing. And this was admitted by Angela Merkel just recently last year. But the desire to make Ukraine a NATO nation, be able to put NATO troops and weapons right on that border there with Russia, is something which was a red line to Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, and hence the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. So Ukraine, not a NATO member. Now that has some benefits because it has been a de facto NATO member without being a NATO member. The benefits to NATO of that are they have been providing NATO weapons and training to Ukrainians since 2014. British Secretary of Defence Brant Shapps this week came out and has stated that. He was bragging about the fact that the Brits have trained over 60,000 Ukrainians since 2014. And now you can go on Google. There are many reports of private military companies, US and UK private military companies operating in Ukraine since 2014 in advisor and teaching and training roles, that sort of thing. Training Ukrainians how to use NATO equipment, on NATO techniques, NATO procedures, and that sort of thing. So Ukraine is not a NATO member. Now, the beauty of that for NATO has been that as Russia attacks Ukraine, a NATO Article 5 event can't be called into effect. Now, the NATO Article 5 states that an attack on one NATO nation is to be considered an attack on all NATO nations, and response by all NATO nations is warranted or expected in that case. So had Ukraine been a NATO nation, and this is why for a long time President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine was clamouring for Ukraine to be admitted to NATO, was because if that was signed in as law and Ukraine joined NATO, then the next bullet fired by a Russian at a Ukrainian, the Ukrainians could have invoked Article 5. And then by rights, NATO would be in a position where it either had to follow through on Article 5 and go boots and all and have troops from Poland and Germany and everywhere else, the other 30 nations, get involved, or they had to look weak by finding some excuse not to do that. So Ukraine not being in NATO has been beneficial in this conflict in one respect. Now, Sweden falls into the same situation. It's going to go to might just go to a map here for us. Let's just have a look at that. Hopefully you can see that okay. The darker blue areas, so this is things like Norway, the United Kingdom, Denmark, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Italy, are founding NATO nations. The next darker blue coming down are those that have joined between 1950 and 2000. You've got in here Spain, Germany, Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Turkey and Greece. The lighter blue colours are those that have joined NATO post-2000 until present. This is after the US had given its guarantees that there would be no further NATO expansion. But this includes Croatia, Macedonia, Albania, Bulgaria, Romania, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia and Finland. Finland most recently, Finland having only joined last year in 2023. Now Sweden hasn't joined. Sweden has applied. Sweden would like to join. It's being held back at this stage primarily by Turkey and by Hungary. Now, Turkey has concerns with Sweden over some religious and political regions. There has been the open burning of the Quran, the holy texts of the Muslim or Islam world. Turkey, a Muslim country, President Erdogan, the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, not particularly happy about that. Also, there are members of a Kurdish party, which Turkey considers to be a terrorist organisation, and they have reportedly been given safe haven. This is a Turkish allegation within Sweden. And these have been the main reasons that Turkey has used for not accepting and agreeing and ratifying Sweden's entry into NATO. Hungary, President Viktor Orban, has been in alignment with Turkey on this and has also declined to ratify Sweden joining. So Sweden's not in there yet. Now, Sweden going in, of course, as I say, that has benefits. If Sweden becomes a nation in NATO, then the entire Baltic Sea, which is this area here, is now NATO, apart from one tiny little area, Kaliningrad, which we'll come back to in a moment, which is going to grow more and more and more important in the coming weeks and months, I think. So if Sweden were to go into NATO, of course, it becomes fully NATO and it can be loaded up with US and NATO missiles and troops and things like that. However, what's happening in Sweden is, much like what was happening in Ukraine, the de facto NATOization of Sweden is going ahead. Finland last year signed a security agreement with the United States, and that agreement would see American military enjoying unimpeded access to all 15 major bases and facilities within Finland. Sweden has just signed a similar agreement with the US. Now, interestingly enough, in the United States Defense Department website's daily releases, I've included a link to this. You can Google it. It's easy to find. I've included a link to it in a previous video from this week. You can go and look at the news section and the releases area, and there are brief statements that come out about what has happened. And so there is one there which is allegedly talking about the conversation between Swedish Defense Minister Jonson and US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, and they talk about this agreement that they have signed, and how the two officials reiterated their support for Ukraine and agreed on the importance of continued bilateral and multilateral collaboration. The agreement they signed was a US-Sweden defence cooperation agreement, and that was signed in December. So this agreement is going to allow increased ability for US to move troops, equipment, trainers, consultants, all of that sort of thing into Sweden, into the Baltics. There will no doubt be training being undertaken by the Swedish in terms of NATO equipment. And we know that that's happening because Sweden have been asked to join NATO's largest exercises. Every year, NATO has a big military exercise in Europe. This year, it's called Steadfast Defender, and it's going to involve over 90,000 troops from the 31 NATO nations, and Sweden have been invited to that. There are going to be wargaming scenarios in Steadfast Defender. It's going to be carried out around Germany, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia. That area is where it's going to be played out. And they're going to be considering things such as a Russian attack onto NATO nations in this area. There are a number of events going on in the next 2 months. Steadfast Defender starts in early February and runs through until May. Originally, I thought it was March, but I've heard now it goes until May. There is a Nordic event kicking off a couple of weeks later, which will have Sweden, Finland, and Norway collaborating together. There is then a British one, the United Kingdom, where maybe I can do that, where the Brits will be having one off in the sea, the North Sea, off to the northeast of the United Kingdom. Aircraft carriers, there'll be hundreds of aircraft, jets, F-35s, all of these sort of things involved in this area. And Sweden is going to be involved. So we know that Sweden is being trained up on NATO military practice and doctrines and use of those weapons and that sort of thing. But there's more. Reports coming from some reliable sources, one of them being Mikael Valtersen, who's an ex-Swedish Air Force member. He tweets regularly on X. He is suggesting that the Swedish public are being told to prepare for war. There are other sources that are reiterating this notion that the Swedish public are being told to prepare for war. Now, not only is this happening in Sweden, but we're getting Western media reports of this happening in Poland and Germany. And so if we just have a look at the map here, Sweden, Poland and Germany are all quite closely grouped together here at the mouth, the entry of the Baltic through here. And what is right next to them is this little grey oblast here, Kaliningrad, which is actually a part of Russia. Now, I think I did an episode just a couple of days ago saying to keep an eye on the Suwalki Gap. The Suwalki Gap is this little stretch of land here which forms the border between Poland and Lithuania and stretches from the tip of Belarus to the tip of Kaliningrad. And as this map here states, Kaliningrad is Russian territory. It is an oblast which is disconnected from the main body of Russia. This week, there are reports that in the Suwalki Gap, if this is so where have I put my image? In the Suwalki Gap, around here, that some form of electronic warfare activity was carried out during the week, which may have been to suppress GPS. The reports that I saw suggest that it was Russian activity carried out across the Suwalki Gap, and it resulted in the loss of GPS signal or capability in Poland and areas of Lithuania for the duration of this test or exercise or attack or whatever it is that you may want to refer to it as. But we are getting this along with reports this week, video footage reportedly showing a freight train in Poland carrying a whole stream of US infantry fighting vehicles or armoured personnel carriers, one or the other, carrying those up reportedly to the border with Poland and Belarus. Let's go back to our map here. So this is Poland right here. Can I make this a little bigger for you? There we go. Even bigger. There we go. Poland and Belarus just here. So in the last week or so, there has been a lot of activity starting to centre around this area. Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania are reportedly considering some sort of activity. They're getting concerned. And they're getting concerned because if Russia manages to take control of the Suwalki Gap, they are suddenly cut off. They're isolated. They are entirely surrounded, as far as land goes, then, by Russia or Russia's partner, Belarus. So these three small NATO nations, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, if the Suwalki Gap were to fall to the Russians and the Belarusians, would become isolated by land. And for them to exit the Baltic Sea by navy, they would have to go past Kaliningrad. This is a situation which Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania do not wish to be in. Right now, they can freely travel down safely through Poland and Poland into Germany and that sort of thing. By the same token, the Russians don't want to see any sort of attack on Kaliningrad. Kaliningrad is Russian territory. Kaliningrad provides Russia with its only port in the Baltic Sea that remains ice-free all year round, is my understanding. St. Petersburg up here, this freezes, so it gets locked with ice. Kaliningrad doesn't, so it provides year-round port access here. Opening that corridor and allowing free entry and travel between Kaliningrad and Belarus and then Russia would be of great strategic importance for Russia to achieve that. So while I'm not suggesting that Russia is looking to start a conflict here and is looking to isolate Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, I'm suggesting it's more likely from what we're hearing with this rhetoric being built up in the West, in Poland and Germany and Sweden, that get ready for war. And the numbers, the time frames are ranging from, you've got 20 years before there'll be a full-on NATO war with Russia, to a German report which came out and then a Polish report which has come out. And the Polish report says, no, 36 months. Within 36 months, we'll be at war with Russia. Poland needs to get ready now. The German report has come out talking about war game scenarios, and they are talking about things starting in February 2024, which is next month. And I actually think one of these diagrams here may have given, this one here from, I think, the Telegraph, the UK Telegraph, gives a series of steps starting in February 2024, working through until May 2025, when NATO starts a war effectively with Russia. So with this growing rhetoric of this in the West, with the position of Sweden where it is, with the perhaps unexpected benefit to NATO that Sweden is not a NATO nation, I think perhaps, I'm speculating here, but, I like to speculate, and before we know what is going to happen is the best time to speculate. I'm speculating that we might see, as Ukraine is lost, and by that I mean as US interest falls in Ukraine because they are aware that they are not going to beat Russia there, as they chew up Ukraine's resources, as Ukraine gets to a point where it can no longer be an effective fighting force for the US in a proxy conflict, because it has lost all of its NATO-trained soldiers. It's lost all of the weaponry that was given to it by NATO. And this is slowly happening to Ukraine. As Ukraine loses its efficacy as a proxy fighter, or as I'm starting to sort of think of them as effectively a private military company for the US and the UK, they're going to look for another one. And now they've got Sweden, and Sweden's not in NATO yet, but it desperately wants to be in NATO, but it's not there yet. And it is just across the Baltic from Kaliningrad. So if the NATO nations, the US did want to, for whatever their reason, perhaps it was just to purely ensure that Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania could not be cut off. So if they wanted to do that, perhaps by assuming control of Kaliningrad. Now, Kaliningrad is isolated. It's tough for Russia to get there directly and fight and protect it. They've got to go through Belarus. Belarus is a partner, but still it complicates things. It's not as easy as being right on the Russian border. You could use Poland. You certainly could use Poland, or you could use Lithuania. But they're NATO nations. If they start the fight and Russia or Belarus reply, then we're in an Article 5 situation. And now some people go, well, yeah, that's perfect. NATO would just jump in boots and all. That sounds good on paper, I agree, but NATO doesn't want to jump in boots and all. Remember, the US and the UK are very hesitant about killing young US men and UK men in a foreign country. Very bad for getting re-elected when you start doing that. Much better if you can kill European young men in a conflict in Europe. Get them to do the work for you. Which sounds cynical, but have a look at Ukraine. Stand back and just have a look. That's what's going on in Ukraine. So, if you wanted to sort of detract Russia's capabilities in the Baltic by getting rid of their Kaliningrad ports, by removing the threat of the Suwalki gap being a choke point for access to Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia by land, well, you could mount an assault on Kaliningrad. And you could have Poland and Lithuania visibly stand back from the front line and say, we're not doing anything, monitor our skies, monitor us with all the radio you like, we're not doing a single thing, not us. But Sweden, which could have had a year or so more of NATO practice in steadfast defender, could have just signed a security agreement with the US, which would allow the US to put troops and advisors and more equipment into Sweden. That could all have happened. Sweden could be coaxed, forced, tricked, coerced, however, led into leading the assault on Kaliningrad. The papers in Sweden could get the rhetoric going. Hey, Russia's going to attack Sweden through Kaliningrad. There's nothing we can do but mount a preliminary strike on Kaliningrad. And now suddenly you've got Sweden in the same position as Ukraine. Sweden fighting some conflict in Kaliningrad. Doesn't really matter how badly Sweden go in fighting it, because it's going to be tough coming across the Baltic. Doesn't really matter how badly they go, because it's not US and UK kids being shot. It's Swedish soldiers fighting, degrading Kaliningrad, and Poland and Lithuania are able to stay out of it. And so NATO doesn't have to get called into this yet. And again, like I was saying before, people might say, oh no, NATO would love you to get in there and just smash Russia. Yeah, but NATO's not ready for that now. Now, maybe in the future, but it's going to take it years to get ready for that. And this has been demonstrated in Ukraine by the public announcement from no one less than the United States President Joe Biden that the reason they turned to supplying Ukraine with 155mm cluster munitions was because they've run out of 155mm high explosive munitions. They don't have that to provide to the Ukrainians anymore. This is across not just the US, but the EU. The EU promised to provide Ukraine with 1 million 155mm shells by March. They've got 6 weeks and they've delivered about a third of that. So the European nations and the US thought going into this conflict that the sanctions would work. They would easily overthrow the Russian military. They would crumble. They would retreat. That Putin may be overthrown because of domestic conflict. None of that turned out that way. And so what was hoped to be a quick victory, remember even when the Ukrainians started their offensive last year in June, it was meant to be a quick days and weeks push down to the Sea of Azov. That didn't happen. So the betting was on a quick win for Ukraine. That didn't come. That has meant that the US and the EU and NATO have supplied far more out of their own stocks and supplies than they might have liked to. Slovakia, President Fico has said yesterday, we are not giving any more aid to Ukraine. We have depleted our stocks already. We can't protect ourselves properly now. Similar things across Europe, it would seem. Now with the Middle East heating up, the Americans are turning their focus there and are sending equipment that was destined for Ukraine to Israel to support Israel. Israel comes first for the US. Ukraine is a distant second. So the NATO nations aren't ready to go up against Russia in a NATO conflict. Yes, they could mount a lot of men very quickly, but if they do, they'll be going up against the Russians and the Belarusians. The Russians have had a lot of frontline combat experience in the last 2 years. They are now a well-oiled working military machine. Poland, Germany, the French, the UK, they've had no experience. Norway, Finland and Sweden have had no experience like that. They're going to have to catch up. They're going to have to deal with all the problems that Ukraine dealt with. They're going to have to deal with the fact that none of the NATO nations at this point in time are facing an existential threat. Now, the Western press is starting to say that is, hey, Poland, you're next. If Ukraine falls, guess who's next on Russia's menu? Germany, once Poland goes, it's you. Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, Russia will have you guys for breakfast. There is no indication from Russia that this is what they want at all. There is just none. And I challenge you, if you think that is the case, to find some, post it, comment it to me, because I would love to see the good, hard, clear evidence that Moscow is planning to just go east and eat Sweden and ultimately the UK, because I just can't see it there. So the NATO nations aren't under an existential threat. Russia, on the other hand, is. Russia is fighting in Ukraine against Ukraine being supplied by all of the NATO nations. And the net result of this is that Russia has moved itself to a war footing. Russia's domestic production has increased multiple times in the last 2 years. The US hasn't. The UK hasn't. The UK is in threat of losing one of its last steel furnace, steel manufacturing plants, even after apparently $500 million pounds of assistance and aid. The owners of that steel plant are saying, no, we're trying to move to green energy principles and it's just not working for us. We can't, it's too expensive. We can't do it that way. Those nations, even combined, are just not moving at the speed that the Russians are because they don't have the direct threat to do so. Now, that may change, but that won't change for years before they're able to catch up to what Russia is doing. Russia's got a head start on them in military production. So the NATO group doesn't want to get into an Article 5 situation at the moment. That's why Germany has voted again not to provide Ukraine with the Taurus long-range missiles. The Taurus long-range missiles have a range of 500 kilometres. From the tip of Ukraine, if you look at our map down here, if you can see the little mouse wiggling around, from this northeastern tip of Ukraine to Moscow is about 430, 450 kilometres. A Taurus would get Moscow, and that's what the Germans are afraid of. They're afraid if they give those Taurus missiles to Ukraine, they'll use them on Moscow. And then Russia will turn around and go, we know where that came from. Germany, you are now in this fight. Turn your AD on because we're coming for you. That's exactly why the Germans haven't provided them yet. That's why the French and the Brits have been providing the export version of the Storm Shadow and the Scalp missiles. They have a restricted range of 290 kilometres. They can't hit Moscow from Ukraine. They can hit other targets, but they can't hit Moscow. So the French and the UK feel okay that if we give these weapons to the Ukrainians and they use them recklessly, well, at least they can't strike Moscow for fuck's sake and get us in real trouble. And again, they don't want that because they're not ready for it. They know that they can't defend themselves. If the Middle East wasn't growing into a regional conflict, which may grow out of hand and be like something we've never seen before, that's a real possibility. Bibi Netanyahu has just stated that Israel will control the land from the river to the sea. This is not a Palestinian saying this. This is Bibi saying this. he is effectively saying, shutting down any idea of there being a two-state solution. Now, the Chinese, the Russians, and even the Americans are now coming out and saying, we've got to have a two-state solution to shut this down, because if we don't have a two-state solution, then the Houthis won't stop, Hamas won't stop, Hezbollah won't stop, and if that continues and grows, ultimately Iran and Turkey will get involved. And then in the Middle East, Israel is cooked if it gets to that level. One way or another. Conventionally, they'll be cooked if Iran and Turkey join the fight. Now, you might say, well, the US will come in and support them. The US will come in and support them, and the US will lose serious assets in that conflict. The Iranians last week just demonstrated they can reach out from Iran to Tel Aviv in Israel with their most recent missile. It went 1,200 kilometres. It went across Iran, it went across Iraq, it went over Syria, and nobody shot it down. Nothing, no air defence got it. So, and it's got a 1,200 kilometre range. So to think that the US won't join in and support Israel if Iran were to get involved is nonsense. Of course the US will. To think the US won't suffer serious damage and casualties like probably they haven't before is also ludicrous to assume. If Turkey and Iran join this fight, if Egypt is convinced to join the fight, then the problems for the US in that area become very large. You know, aircraft carriers. The Iranians have weapons that can take out aircraft carriers. Aircraft carriers are very useful for the force deployment, for putting your aircraft into an area, but they're not land-based. They have limitations. They have limitations on how many aircraft they can service within a period of time. They can't move very quickly. If they are to become a target, there are capabilities now that the Arab nations have to destroy those aircraft carriers. If an aircraft carrier is lost, that is a major loss to the US in many ways, and something which would severely deplete their ability to support Israel. Now you might say, well, still Israel will win because Israel's got nuclear weapons and they will throw them at Iran and they'll turn Iran to glass. That may be the case. But if that happens, then there will be nuclear missiles coming from Turkey and Pakistan into Israel. Now, there have already been announcements from Pakistan that if Turkey wants them, they will give them nuclear weapons to protect themselves, and they would be used in that case against Israel. It's moving more and more and more to be a no-win situation for Israel in this conflict. And the key figure in this is Benjamin Netanyahu. If Benjamin Netanyahu were to say, okay, we will figure out a two-state peace plan. If he were to say that and then to be legitimate about that and follow that path, that would be a way out. Because then Hamas, Hezbollah, everyone in the region can say, okay, we're going to start to draw up what these boundaries should look like. It's really going to suck for you, Bibi, because you're going to lose land. But this could stop the conflict. If we're going to have this discussion, okay, we can stop shooting at each other while we'll have this discussion. Good Lord, if we actually allocate some land and we open it up and there's autonomy given and Israel doesn't have control over these areas anymore, shit, that's real progress. We could stop the fighting. But Benjamin Netanyahu is in a bind. He has corruption charges against him that he's trying to delay in court. He currently has a conflict in Israel which is popular with the Israeli people, yet he himself is not popular. And he is going to likely lose his role once this war is over. And once this war is over, he's going to have to face the music as to why did Hamas get this head start on us? How did you guys not know this attack was going to happen? Ugly questions are going to be asked. So he wants to prolong this war for his own personal reasons. Now, that might be the absolute wrong thing for a leader to do, and I agree with you. He shouldn't do that. He shouldn't put his own personal desires in front of the nation. But that's not to say that's not what is happening. If Benjamin Netanyahu can keep this conflict going and can keep himself in power and can use whatever leverage he might have upon the US to have them supporting him, then he stays out of the frying pan. He's got power, he's got wealth, and he's not in prison. And obviously that's where he does not want to end up, but things would be looking like that. So with Benjamin Netanyahu saying there's no two-state peace plan going to happen, we are going to control all of this land. And when he says all that, he's not just talking about Gaza, he's talking about the West Bank there and parts of Syria, I think, ideally. When he's saying that, there's no way to de-escalate from that position because everyone surrounding is against that position. And so there is a report today that the Israelis have said to Hezbollah, we are basically going to, if you don't meet some of our demands, we are going to begin to expand our activities on our northern border with you. Now, at the moment, Israel's fighting Hamas. Apparently 40,000 fighters, limited resources, limited supply in a small area, completely locked in by the Israelis. No ability for them to increase the level of military supplies that they had beyond what they had on October the 7th. It's only going downhill, their capability from there. Hezbollah is a very different kettle of fish. Hezbollah, Lebanon, freely can move north and east into other Arab nations and be resupplied. They have reportedly 150,000 rockets and guided missiles, many of which can reach any area of Israel. If they do decide to join the conflict, then southern Lebanon and northern Israel are going to suffer a lot of damage. This may politically start to turn the tide against Benjamin Netanyahu. I don't know. I'm not in Israel. I don't know what it is on like the ground. I did see today some video reporting to be of a co-Israeli-Palestinian protest for peace in Israel. I couldn't corroborate that, but that's what it was reportedly showing. If that is the case, then there is at least in Israel some growing discontent and some opposition to what is going on. So a fight with Hezbollah, which then ruins the northern area of Israel, will not be something that's particularly well received. Also, Israel is suffering economically. War is expensive. They are burning through weapons. They are buying hundreds of millions of dollars of new weapons from the United States. Their tourism industry is going down the tubes. I mean, who wants to go and take their kids to a country where there's a good chance you might get bombed by one side or the other at some stage? So tourism, which is a large draw for dollar for Israel, is just declining at the moment. Plus, Israel called back something like 300,000 of its volunteers. Now, it's engaging them in conflict. It has to pay for them. It has to pay for their food, their lodging, whatever else they're doing, their training, their medical care, their transport. All of these sort of things costs a lot of money. Plus, it has pulled a lot of people in Israel out of the workforce into military activity. So that means the industry in some areas is closing down and shutting down and, needing to be replaced by people perhaps not as skilled or familiar. So there's a slowdown. So economically, this is tough for Israel. And of course, it's orders of magnitude tougher for Gaza, but that's not what I'm comparing here. What I'm saying is that for Israel, this is not going to continue to be a great situation for Netanyahu. So we might be seeing, that writhing kind of last dying moments of him here, which is why he is saying we're going to control this territory from the river to the sea. There'll be no two-state solution while I'm around. Hezbollah, just do as we say or we will attack you. There is a big risk what is being done here, a very, very big risk what is being done here. So that conflict there, which is growing and growing and growing, is stripping away focus from Ukraine and weakening Ukraine and making Ukraine a husk and making Ukraine less able to be the proxy fighter for the US and for NATO. And this, again, is part of the reason why Sweden to me feels like it might be being set up to fill that role. It's the next nation. It's a very developed nation, and it's got military capability. It can be supplied with additional military capability. It can be routed in from Finland and from Norway and that sort of thing. If they were to be, for whatever reason, engaged in a conflict, say with Kaliningrad. Now, as I've said right from the start, this is speculation. Of course, I don't know that this is going to happen. But you can see how that Suwalki gap, and that Suwalki gap is not big. The Suwalki gap here, this little red part here, it's only 62 kilometers long. It's easy to put under control by short-range missiles. Chewing out a little chunk of Lithuania there, I imagine you would probably leave Poland alone, but that would, again, I guess, depend on what the terrain is like. But if the Russians wanted to capture this area here and solidify it, chew out some of Lithuania, it becomes pretty easy then to start saying to the Lithuanians, ooh, you guys are next. Shit, you guys are in trouble. You better get ready for war. Build the rhetoric, get those people all concerned. Russia's not really looking to do this, but it becomes the great story then that that's what Russia's going to do. If that's the case, we need to get in preemptively. Sweden, come on, you guys want to prove your mettle and be part of NATO? You start the attack on Kaliningrad, stop the Russians from taking that part of Lithuania, and you've got your next proxy war against Russia, actually against Russia, where it's going to be a little bit tougher for Russia to fight. Russia doesn't have a big, thick border right against the fighting zone. There's going to be this thin little strip within which they can go through Belarus to fight, but the Russians will not lose Kaliningrad. Kaliningrad is vitally important to the Russians. They're not going to just sit back and go, fine, have Kaliningrad, we're not worried about it. We'll get it later. So it is a leverage point for NATO if they wish to. And why wouldn't you get Sweden in there to do it? Chew up Sweden's resources first without having to get NATO pulled into the fight. And then when you're ready, that's when Poland could fire a missile across into Belarus or Russia when they're ready, and that can happen. All right. I hope you've enjoyed this wild speculation from me on the Deep 404 today. If you're enjoying the channel and you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. And if you do think others would like it, please share some links to the videos. I'm putting the videos up on Twitter now. Look for the Deep 404 on Twitter so you can share them around there. I hope you're having a great weekend, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.